Hey guys! In this video we'll look at ways of getting around the situation where you're trying to work on a mashup but you don't have a vocal on its own. While it's possible to create great mashups without a vocal on its own, having one does give you a lot more flexibility and creative control. A vocal that appears on its own is called an acapella, and it used to be quite standard for dance tracks to be released with them, so that DJs could play the acapellas over the top of other records during DJ sets. These days, record labels don't want unofficial remixes to be made of their songs, so they tend not to include acapellas anymore. However, that doesn't mean that they're completely off the table. If you can't find the acapella for a track you're looking for, but you desperately want it, there's a chance you can create your own using a series of techniques. Acapellas that are created this way are called do-it-yourself acapellas. Let's look at some of the tricks you can use to try and extract a vocal from a full track. In the last video, we finished off by looking at a transition between two tracks, a break track and a main track. The transition was starting to sound pretty good, but we could have an extra level of control if we could get our hands on the vocal in the track. In some cases, you are actually able to extract a vocal from a full version. To learn how, firstly, let's discuss the concept of phase cancellation. At any given time in an audio signal, the amplitude of that signal sits somewhere between completely positive or completely negative. This later on translates to the position of the speaker cone when we play it back. If there's nothing but silence in the signal, the waveform will just rest in the middle, that is, neither positively nor negatively charged. For this kind of signal, the speaker cone will sit in its natural position, directly in the middle. When looking at audio as a waveform, the louder the audio signal is, the more wildly it swings positively above the middle line and negatively below the middle line. It's this constantly swinging signal that Live displays to us visually as a waveform in the audio clip. If you place two pieces of identical audio on separate tracks at the same time as one another, the peaks will be exactly in sync. For the positive peaks, all of the identical peaks will combine together at the master channel, resulting in a peak that is twice as positive as either of them. And the same goes for the negative peaks. This would sound the same as if we had taken one piece of audio and doubled the power of it, which makes sense, because adding two identical signals together should be the same as just doubling the power of one of them. Going back to our two identical waveform scenario, if we invert one of the audio tracks, we flip the wave around its zero line, converting all of the positive peaks into negative peaks, and the negative peaks into positive peaks. When one signal is combined with another that has an identical but inverted signal, all of the positive wave peaks of one track will combine with all of the exact negative peaks of the other, resulting in a completely phase-cancelled, silent piece of audio. We can use this to our advantage when we know two audio files to be identical except for one small difference. One doesn't have a vocal in it. Using this theory, if we line up the wave peaks exactly and invert one of the files, all of the audio information common to both signals will cancel out, leaving only the difference between the signals. The situation where this comes in really handy is when we have a track that's released as a full version, as well as an instrumental version. We can simply take the original version and the instrumental version, import them both into our DAW, and invert one of them. Then we can line them up so that the peaks occur at exactly the same time, and we should be able to cancel out all of the instrumental. To do this, create a new live session especially for the task. Import your vocal and instrumental versions, and place them on neighbouring audio tracks. Don't perform any warping on the audio. Make sure to turn warping off on both clips. That said, it's a good idea to find out the BPM of the track and make sure your live session reflects it. This will make it easy for us to chop 8-bar sections out if we need to. Zoom right in and make sure the peaks between the two tracks line up exactly. The easiest way to do this is by going from the very start of the song. But don't assume the original and the instrumental have the same amount of silence at the start. They may not. To drag the audio around freely on the grid, go to Options and turn off Snap to Grid. If possible, it's also important to get both versions from the same source. For instance, if you've downloaded an MP3 of the original track, and then gone looking for an instrumental and found a WAV version, try and find a WAV version of the original as well. Where possible, it's best to use a WAV or AIFF file for phase cancellation because otherwise the peaks won't match up perfectly. bring both audio tracks down by 6 dB so that the audio won't clip at the master. We can worry about the volume of the final version later on. Then, to invert the audio signal on one of the tracks, place a utility device on the device chain for the instrumental version of the track, and enable both phase left and phase right settings. Have a listen through. If the versions are truly identical except for the vocal, there should be little or no music or drums behind the vocal. Now that you're able to hear what the phase cancellation is doing, you can subtly move the instrumental track around and hear where the best spot for cancellation is. Sometimes, one element will sound more cancelled at a certain sync point, but another element starts to creep through. This is okay, just try and find the best balance you can. I'd suggest using headphones for this part as opposed to speakers. There are small audio artifacts and high-frequency bleed-through that can escape your attention on speakers. Be aware that even the final master of a song can sometimes drift, and you'll need to listen through and make sure the tracks line up all the way. If they don't, create small splices in one of the tracks where the peak starts to go out of sync and shift it manually back into sync. Try to time your edit points between lyrics, because any sections without vocal will just be muted later. The most important thing is to preserve the vocal. Also bear in mind that instrumental versions are often 8 to 16 bars shorter than the original song, edited down because there's not a vocal in there to keep things as interesting. Quite often, you'll need to listen through and figure out which sections have been removed from the instrumental so that you can splice and move the clips accordingly and make sure the right sections sync up. This is why it's important to have your session and grid set to the actual song's tempo. During this process, you're very much at the mercy of what steps the producer happened to go through while producing the song. Anything created using random fluctuations, such as the oscillation of synths, white noise generator effects, or the random scattering of reverbs, will differ between versions, unless they were rendered at some point during production. Such sounds will not sync up peak for peak between versions, and you may hear some drifting noise or effect sounds in the background of your finished DIY acapella. Inside of me. When listening to the phase-cancelled result of our example track, we can hear that the original and instrumental versions must have been bounced separately, because you can hear that instruments that have such random fluctuations, like the synths and reverbs, are being produced at different times, and therefore they're not phase-cancelling perfectly. Although quite ugly when heard on their own, these little musical ghost sounds are usually not a problem in mashups. The producer has timed white noise effects to occur at the same point we want them to anyway, and extra reverb and synth noise will at least be in key with the rest of your mashup. Even a tiny little bit of drum information leaking through can be okay, because you'll be making sure your elements are in rhythm anyway. After you've decided your acapella is as isolated as you're going to get to work on cleaning it up. Firstly, use muting and fading to completely silence all parts of the acapella that aren't useful to you. I often render what I have at this point so that I can work on a single wave clip, but I suggest you to use track volume automation on the master channel in case you find little sync issues you need to go back and change without having to rebounce the whole thing. Use the automation to completely silence long sections between vocals and to perform little fades in or out of vocals to help hide those little musical ghosts as lyrics taper off. The next step is to use EQ to clean up a bit. It's very important to only use EQ on the master channel, not on any of the individual channels. If you use EQ on one of your individual tracks, it will actually change the phase relationships between the frequencies and push the peaks around, causing two tracks to come back out of sync. Because vocals usually only have information down to around 100 Hz, we can filter off everything under that point. This should take care of any thuddy remainders of the kick drum or the bass, as well as any low-end audio problems that we might not notice as a result of the phase cancel process. Be conservative at this point. You can always add some more severe filtering when you're actually working on your mashup. If there's a little bit of hi-hat noise spilling through, which there often is, you can try the same thing using a low-pass filter up the top. Bring it down from the highest frequencies to see if you can eliminate some of the hi-hats or rides. But be very careful. It's much more important to keep the sibilance of the vocal intact for lyrical clarity than it is to silence the drum spill. Acapellas are useless if you can't actually hear the lyrics. So if in doubt, don't alter the top end at all. If you think any additional EQ band changes around the middle can help clean up the vocal or bring out the vocal elements while pushing something else away, then go for it. There may be a snare or a hi-hat poking through that you can use a very surgical notch EQ to pull out. Just be sparing with them because they're likely to negatively affect the vocal. Lastly, add an additional device plugin that has mid-side functionality. Most of the time when you're dealing with an EQ plugin, it makes changes to both the left and right channel automatically. But you can set some EQs up so that there are bands that only affect the left side or only affect the right side. Similarly, there are EQs that allow you to change the channel relationship so that instead of dealing with a left side channel and a right side channel, you'll be working with a mid channel and a side channel. Making changes to the mid channel will alter audio that is present in both the left and right channels, whilst making changes to the side channel will affect audio that's panned to either the left or the right side. The reason that we want to process the audio in this way is that the vocal almost always sits directly in the center of a stereo mix. Many of those elements that we had trouble with during phase cancellation, like white noise, reverbs, and synths, are almost always spread out across the stereo field. This means that using mid-side processing, we can make changes to and hopefully eliminate those side elements while leaving the vocal relatively untouched. You can use EQ8 for this. Firstly, pull out absolutely everything on the side channel to see if this improves the clarity on the vocal. Switch it to mid-side mode and select the side by clicking M and setting up a high-pass filter and literally setting the frequency to the highest setting. You should feel that all the stereo information has been sucked out of the music, leaving you only with audio that sounds like it's coming from directly in front of you.
There was some way to pass all this fire to you.
This may be all you actually need to produce a noticeable change in the acapella, dropping out a lot of the noise around the edges. If you find that the vocal itself suffers a lot, it may be because the vocal is double-tracked, meaning that it's recorded twice, with each version panned slightly to the side. If this is the case, you'll have to settle for pulling out perhaps 50% of the side signal. If your EQ doesn't have a volume controller for each channel, such as EQ8 here, change your high pass to a low shelf setting to effectively turn it into a broadband volume control for the side channel.
Then I wouldn't care if we don't make it.
Starting at 0 gain, pull it down until you find a good balance between the instruments disappearing and the vocal starting to lose its integrity. Have a listen through to make sure that you're completely happy with what you hear, or if there's anything else that you can do to make it better. Go back to the master track and make up the 6 dB we lost at the beginning, either by using a utility plugin to increase the gain by 6 dB before a limiter device, or within the limiter device itself by increasing the input by 6 dB. To finish up, go to Options and make sure Snap to Grid is on again. Create a selection on the timeline on any track and define the area you want to export. Then render your new do-it-yourself acapella to a WAV file of its own, where it can be used in mashup sessions later on. Ensure that you begin on a bar that makes sense, to make things easier for yourself when you import it later. If there's a lead-in to the first lyric, you can even provide a whole 4 or 8 bars of silence beforehand to make it really obvious to yourself what the phrasing is. When you export it, make sure you specify in the file name that it's a DIY to warn yourself to listen out for those effects, floaty background noises, or subtle remains of drum loops. You should know the tempo of the song now, so include this in the file name too, to save you having to figure it out every time you use the acapella from here on. These methods can get you the acapellas for some seriously good songs and really open up your options for creating mashups. It's unfortunate, but less and less music is released with acapellas and even instrumentals these days. It used to be standard for dance tracks to be released as an extended mix, an original or radio style mix, and an instrumental mix. With this in mind, it becomes more and more necessary to try and create acapellas without the aid of an instrumental. Though they won't usually sound very good on their own, some DJs make very usable DIY acapellas even when there's no instrumental track to phase cancel with. There are two ways to go about this, and both use the same techniques as we've already covered. Firstly, if you're trying to grab an acapella from an electronic-based track with plenty of repetition, you may be able to use the method we've covered already. Instead of using an instrumental version of the track, you simply find a section of the original with no vocal and place it next to a section with vocal. You use the same syncing method to line up the peaks and see what cancels. If the two sections are instrumentally similar enough, you might be able to get a passable cancellation. At the very least, the drums will usually cancel nicely, perhaps leaving a layer of hi-hat, ride, or something small, which is not a big deal. You'll have to do a lot of chopping and changing to find out which parts phase cancel the best, which is why it's important to have the grid correct in relation to the song already. Sadly, this technique requires the music underneath to be very simplistic, repetitive, and to contain lots of instrumental section. Many tracks simply aren't set up that way anymore, instead using short, ever-changing sections to keep audiences interested. The biggest obstacles are changes in the musical elements as the song progresses, such as fluctuating chord movements or constantly varying melody lines. These will not cancel when sampled from different sections, instead something to create multiple music lines smashed together and becoming twice as noticeable as they were before. But it's worth a try if the acapella is seriously desirable. It's a little more likely to work in either older tracks or drawn-out styles like house music, which will often only use a short 8-bar phrase of vocal. The changes in this style of music are so patiently spread out across the track that the addition of a vocal is likely to be the only change between one 8-bar section and the next. This means it'll cancel beautifully. The second method, which is pretty much an absolute last resort, is to literally apply processing to the track without using any phase cancellation. This pretty much never gives you an acapella of the quality needed to do remixing with, but if it's used in the right context, it can just barely scrape across the line in terms of usability in a mashup. For this method, you just import your song and begin by using the EQ and mid-side processors you learned just before. You'll depend very heavily on your mid-side processing for this. Many do-it-yourself acapella creators also use volume automation or even complex plugins for automatically muting audio beneath a certain volume, called noise gates, to pull volume down in the small gaps between vocals. This is a tricky one though. I believe that it's often more trouble than it's worth, as the listener will hear strange foreign instruments launch into awareness every time the vocalist sings something, before disappearing just as suddenly. This draws even more attention and causes even more distraction. In cases such as this, it's usually best to leave the extraneous instruments as running at a constant level and to only use the acapella in mashups with tracks that can effectively obscure those instruments. One other tool that you can use to your advantage is a noise reduction processor. These work by feeding the processor a sample of noise on its own so that it can learn what frequencies make up the noise, and then feeding it a piece of music so that it can reduce those frequencies across the whole recording in an attempt to remove the noise. For a free plugin that does the job quite well, look no further than the plugin Reaffir. Designed for the digital audio workstation Reaper, it's also available free from www.reaper.fm/reaplugs, and works as a noise reduction processor when set to subtract mode. For paid options, denoise in Isotopes RX or noise reduction in Adobe Audition are great options. If you want to use one of these plugins, make sure that you do all the above steps first and that you've rendered it into one single WAV file. It works better on those small ghosting sounds than it does on actual drums. That's why it's best to use the most isolated acapella you can first. Find the largest section of music that has no vocals, but all the leftover noise and ghosts that you don't want in the track. Then open up the noise reduction process and tell it to learn that noise profile. Select the short section where the vocal plays and experiment with it, previewing each time. Too much noise reduction will reduce the frequencies it interprets as noise so much that it will affect your vocal, usually resulting in a familiar dulling and morphing feel in the vocal.
Visions from the past, clouding my clarity.
You'll hear a lot of this effect on DIY acapellas you find on the internet that have been processed too far. Back it off to an acceptable level. Also, play around with the frequency settings if there are any. Reducing the noise reduction in frequency sections where the process is doing too much damage, such as the top end, can rescue the lyrics. As you'll hear, the processor faces a pretty tough job trying to reduce the noise without killing the vocal, because the human voice covers so much of the frequency spectrum. But a little bit of it can help. You'll generally get much better results if you are able to phase cancel away much of the instrumental first. Once you've found your desired balance, extend your selection to fit the whole file and process it.
It's just another way for you to take it out. It's just another chance for you to make it out.
Listen through closely, and if you're happy, export it. Lastly, I want to stress that you shouldn't feel too disheartened about the lack of acapellas available today. Though they have been a great mashup tool in the past, you can still take advantage of a great vocal simply by using the song itself as a breakdown track, and by utilizing smart arrangement to put the vocal in the places that you want.
This is the end.
In the next video, we'll check out editing intros and outros. Thanks for watching.